Good morning, everybody. My name is Hussein, and with me here, my colleague Lang. We'll be giving you this annual session that we've been giving every Dev Summit since the last 3 years. It's meant to be an intermediate to advanced attribute rule session where we give you tips and tricks to improve the performance, to understand the nuts and bolts of how attribute rules work under the hood, so that you can make better decisions in your workflows. So let's get started. I added some more content for this session, so hopefully we can get through it this year. We'll talk about a little bit of an introduction attribute rules. I'll try to quickly jump through that. The events, attribute rule events, when attribute rules executes actually. We'll talk about a re-entry, which is a very, very interesting concept, recursion essentially. Execution context, where attribute rules execute. We'll talk about the geodatabase releases and attribute rules, the evolution of attribute rules, especially if you have multiple versions of Enterprise Pro, how does that play with field maps? We'll talk about schema locking and attribute rules, and finally we'll do some performance tips, and Ling is going to show us a demo of how to identify slowly running attribute rules in your production. So let's get started. So introduction, a little bit refresher. Attribute rules introduced in 2.1 and Enterprise 10.6. It's a core geodatabase concept just like subtypes and domain. Think of them as a schema, as part of your schema. You use Arcade to author these, and they live in the geodatabase. The beauty of this is wherever you issue a command to edit something from whatever client, that is being runtime, services, Pro, Python, eventually we will always catch it at the lower level of the geodatabase, and attribute rules will always run, and that's the power here. There are two types, calculation and constraints, and there's also batch type, calculation and validation, which runs on demand. And it also was introduced in runtime back in April 2022. So we'll start with the eventing of attribute rules. So normal attribute rules execute on an editing trigger, such as insert, update, and delete. And we call those immediate attribute rules. In the UI, you will see them as immediate, calculation, and constraint, right? So if I make an insert, an update, or a delete, I want you to run this rule. And every rule can be specified to be run, hey, I want this rule to run on insert or update or delete or all of the three. The other type is on demand. It's like, I'm not really making an edit. I have data and I know there's things to be fixed in this existing data or errors. I know there's some bad data in this data set, and I want to identify them. And this is where batch calculation rules comes in, and on demand. We use the validation service to do that. And the error inspector. You would run a button called evaluate, and it will, based on an extent or full extent, it will run all of these. Just watch out for this because we're evaluating something, that evaluate may trigger other immediate attribute rules through a DML. So just watch out for that. Conflict resolution, that's another place where attribute rules run, especially when you reconcile your branch and then you say, okay, I want to replace this edit with the common ancestor or the default or the child version. That in itself is an edit, right? And that will trigger attribute rule, right? So it might not be obvious that it's an edit, but it's actually an edit. And the final one is actually a little bit tricky, but reconcile by attributes, because reconcile you can do it two types, by row, the conflict resolution, or by attribute. So that is, if I reconcile by row, like anything that's changed between default and version, even if they are two different columns, the reconcile will detect a conflict, right? But by attribute, right, if you reconcile by attribute, only those changes that matches. Like if you edit field A on default and edit field B on A in default, then that's a conflict. right? If you edit different fields, that is not considered a conflict, right? So that's reconciled by attribute, and that may trigger attribute rules in certain cases. Okay, let's talk about re-entry and avoiding infinite execution. So attribute rules have a capability that allows you, when I insert a feature, I can write code to update other features. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind, like, what happens if that other thing that I update comes back and updates something else? And that thing comes back and updates the same thing. You will end up in a recursion, right, as commonly known in programming. And this can lead to, problems and infinite recursion. We catch those, and we detect those cycles, as we call them, and we give you up to 5 cycles. And 99% of the cases, it's almost always an infinite loop. I found one case the other day, actually last week in GeoNet, where someone actually had a legit reason where they needed more than 5 cycles. But I worked with them to find another workaround to avoid that. But that was an interesting use case. But essentially keep that in mind. And the error is, you'll see this error. It's called the evaluation of attribute rule is cyclic or exceeds maximum cascading level. So yeah, something to watch out for. So in this case, feature A updates feature B, but B comes back and updates A, and feature A updates B again. And that's basically it. Okay, let's talk about execution context. Really one of the most critical, concepts to understand in attribute rules. So attribute rules, as we said, live in the geodatabase, see? And this orange box, the backend data source, is what you can think of this as your file GDB or your ArcGIS server or your enterprise geodatabase, right? And then the attribute rules live in the geodatabase right there, right? In the class, to be specific, where you added your attribute rules. But then there's the other part, there's the application. And the application makes an edit to the backend data source. And you can see that there are 2 lines in this particular case. So let's take an example where the application is pro or fields map, and the backend data source is server, ArcGIS server or enterprise, right? So in this case, the user edit, the first arrow all the way to the left, is the user using the UI to actually make the edit, right? So I'm making an edit in the application. Optionally, the attribute rules can live in the application, can be downloaded if the application knows how to deal with them in the application. And the rules will be executed on that user edit in the application. We still didn't even reach the service. We didn't even send the apply edit. We're all local. And especially in Pro, we have a feature, local feature cache that we keep up to date and sync. So that's one way, right? And then once those edits are executed, you then send the actual command to the backend source, whether this is be a service or a file GDB, all the way to that. And then the rules run again. Yes, attribute rules run twice in certain cases, okay? So another example without a service is, even if you have an application with a file GDB, say Pro, if you open the attribute pane and you start editing, but you didn't hit apply, the attribute rules still execute in the Pro editor pane, even though you didn't hit apply, which didn't send the cursor edit to the file GDB. So this concept even apply outside of the service, right? So there is local execution, and there is the actual server execution or the backend execution. It gets confusing because that command, we used to call it server only, but then you can really work with attribute rules without a server. So we kind of changed it to say, do you want the rules to run on the application, essentially, right? So let's take an example. So rules, one thing to mention is, rules can be excluded from application evaluation. You can say, hey, I don't want this rule to execute on the application at all. This rule has no business to execute on the application because, well, for certain reason, or sometimes the application doesn't know what to do with them. An example is sequences. If you deal with database sequences, if you download this rule all the way to the application, there is no such thing as a database sequence, right? Especially if you're behind a service, right? So some rules require to be excluded from application evaluation, and that's rule 2 in that example, right? So in my particular case, rule 2 is excluded, but rule 1 and rule 3 are allowed to be executed in the application. So you would download them. Once the application starts, it connects to the servers or the backend and downloads a copy of attribute rules. Yes, it's a copy of attribute rules, which can get stale, which we'll come to that point later, right? So a user makes an edit, will execute rule 1 and 2, and rule 1 and 3, and then the final output, because those 2 rules may have changed the user edit. So the final result is what is actually sent to the server. And again, we're gonna run rule 1, rule 2, and rule 3. Well, rule 2 didn't get run on the application in that case because we have excluded from server, from client evaluation. And if you ever seen this error before, like table not found in a GUID, that is an example of a rule you have a rule that reading from a class, and this class is not published in your service. Right? So you have class A and class B, and class A is reading class B, as you can see from feature side by name. But then you only published class A, and then you're behind the service, or in front of it in this case, right? And then you consume it, the application downloads this rule and says, all right, I want to execute this rule, but it says, wait a minute, what is class B? I don't know what class B is because it's not available in the service, right? And that is one of the problems that we see, that users will miss publishing the entire graph of what the dependency of attribute rules is. And I think in 3.3, if I'm not mistaken, we're porting it back, we're adding a new analyzer that tells you that, hey, you're publishing this class, but it also needs this and this and this. It's a warning. It's not going to be an error. It's like, do you really want to publish these extra classes? Because otherwise, you're going to get an error if you don't. All right. Okay, let's talk about geodatabase releases. So everything in attribute rule really depends on other constructs, such as there is a language that is called Arcade. There's the geodatabase itself. And Arcade is a language that is continuously evolving. Okay? And we make schema changes to attribute rule. And the geodatabase itself continues to evolve. We add new fields. So we have versioning attached to every rule that you create. Okay? So if you create a certain rule, it tells you that, hey, this particular rule is, you need minimum pro version 2.3, minimum enterprise release 10.7, and minimum arcade release 1.5. And this is critical. You can show these columns in the view by clicking columns and click on release. And that will tell you what are the required releases, because we know that sometimes we work in a new version of Pro, but the enterprise is a little bit lagging behind, such as 10.9.1 enterprise, but I have, 3.1 Pro or something newer, right? So in this case, you might be tempted to use a new functionality in 3.1 or 3.3 that is not available in 10.9.1. So you would create a rule that uses a certain features. Let's give an example, actually. $sign feature set was introduced in Pro 2.8, right? If you used $sign feature set in your script, $sign feature set, by the way, gives you a pointer to your current data set. So you don't have to do feature set by name yourself, essentially. It's just a convenient global. So once you do that, this class will not be able to be opened in Pro 2.7 or earlier releases. And correspondingly, it won't be able by those enterprise releases as well. So services, you might have found in certain cases, you added a rule, and all of a sudden, your services don't start. Well, that's the reason. In the server log, we're pretty sure we tell you exactly why it doesn't start, because the minimum client release has exceeded, but attribute rules here will tell you what exactly that concept. Okay, here's another example. You can see that this one is a little bit tricky. I have a simple ArcGIS script, yet, you see the mouse, right? Yeah. You can see that the minimum release is actually 2.7 and 10.9. And the reason is, despite the ArcGIS being very, very basic, is this box. Field was required prior to 2.7, but it was made optional in 2.7 and later. So if you made the field optional, then you kind of upgraded your class. And it's kind of something we should have thought about. We shouldn't have made it the default, because accidentally users will leave it empty, and then they will accidentally upgrade that class. Another example is this one. This one is really recent. In 3.2, we introduced the new field types, like a date only. So if you assign date only field, make sure that, just know that we were gonna bump up your attribute rule. As a result, the class will be bumped up. Any services, older clients won't be able to open it. Doing good on time. Let's talk about schema locking. It's a very interesting concept. Just like any other, schema in the geodatabase, such as fields, or domains part of it, subtypes, attribute rule is just a schema to the class. And changing it require an exclusive lock to the class. So that means nobody should be reading from that class, reading in a sense that is nobody should have opened that class. Whether this is a pro or a service started and that is consuming that class, we shouldn't have that. And for example, when we start services, we have a set of ArcSoc processes that start and acquire by default a shared lock on the classes that it actually opened. Yeah? As a result, that's something you've seen. You try to edit your rule and says, oh, I cannot do that because I cannot acquire exclusive schema lock. And the reason is because there is a service that's using it. Well, one solution is to stop the service, of course, and then add the attribute rules or alter the attribute rules, and then start it back up. And this is critical. You might say, why do you guys like torturing us? I know it's painful, I understand. Well, it's a correctness issue. Like, let's assume we don't do this, which is, by the way, there is an option to not do this in the server. In Server Manager, you can go to the options on the service. There's literally something called don't acquire database lock, and it will stop doing that. But if you do, we tell customers, you can do that, but know these ramifications. What are the ramifications of not forcing users to stop the service? Well, you make a change to your attribute rule, or you add a new attribute rule, and then the SOC is caching the old rules. And even worse, Pro or field map is also caching those old rules, correct? So if we don't stop the service, what will happen is the user, you make the edit, you move on, but all the services, all the processes are still using the old rules. They will never just think about, oh, you know what, let's just, let me talk to the database again and pull. Maybe there is a change. We never do that. Right? So what will happen is your users will still see the old behavior. So if you added a constraint rule and it said, oh, I just edited and it's not working, the reason is the service didn't even see the new rule, right? Or the new change. So we stop the service and we start it back to essentially kill all the processes and start them all back so they pick up the latest change. The alternative is just to wait for processes to, slowly terminate and then come back up. Because processes are based on the minimum number of instances and the maximum number of instances. So if nobody's using them, they slowly will become idle, and there is an idle timeout, which will basically terminate those processes. Moreover, every 24 hours, there is a recycling process that kicks in. You can rely on that. It says, I can live with that. Users can tolerate not having the latest and deal with that. Alternatively, there is a way to do rolling restarts. If you have two server instances, you can make the change, which will work if you disable schema locking. Then you go to your first server, and you just restart the whole service together, the Windows service itself. So this way, the web adapter will detect that, well, the whole machine just went down, but I still have another one up and running. So the users will not feel that they actually disconnected. They will continue working off one node. The first server will come back up with the fresh latest rule, and then you do the same thing with the second node. You stop the service, the web adapter or the load balancer like Nginx or whatever you're using will just switch back to the available node. And that's how another approach to do rolling restart, so that the users can see the latest stuff, yet not experience as much downtime. We talked about this. Yeah, let's talk about performance. We're doing good on time. Attribute rule performance steps. I usually like to, during the year, I collect some of the scripts I see to demonstrate them here. Of course, I remove any, information that about the script here. But here are some tips about how to make your attribute rules, I guess, faster. Well, the first thing is skip evaluation if possible. That's one of the best things. If you can avoid unnecessary queries, unnecessary computations, skip them and quit as early as possible. Use this return semicolon to quit early, of course. Assign subtypes. If you assign your rule to a specific subtype, then if we edit a class that is not of that subtype, we will not even consider that rule to begin with. And not considering a rule, that means not hydrating a fresh arcade engine, which means we save on the cost of spinning up the arcade engine, which is where the most of the the time is spent. So if you only take the hit when you edit your subtype, right? Not other subtypes, right? Another option is that let clients run expensive rules locally. This is tricky to do, but you can do it. If you allow a client evaluation and you say, like, I'm doing a spatial query, and the client, like a pro, does a feature cache, you can execute that spatial query locally and populate whatever value you have, and then all the rule will run locally, and then you send the edit, of course. If the server, of course, will run rule again, and will say, oh, if this field is populated, that means the client has already did it work. I'm just gonna quit and exit early. So you avoid the spatial query on the server side, which is really, it saves tremendous, right? And it adds up if you have a lot of, queries. Combining rules, we always say that every time we instantiate an arcade engine, there is a cost associated with that. So if you combine your rules into fewer rules, we have less arcade engines to worry about, right? So we work with fewer instances, and as a result, it's faster. Plus, the bloat of the data definition of the class becomes less and less. right? The overhead, let's say. And you can use this edit type. In every rule, you can know if you're editing, inserting, or updating, which is interesting. Count versus first, that's another tip. I've seen users use count to check if something exists, and that's not a good idea, because if you do a count and you happen to scan, because count has to scan the entire data set or the entire filter, and has to do it one by one, right? Versus if you're doing it first, that means you're instantiating a cursor, but you're only picking the first row. That's all what you're interested in. And if that first row is null, that means you know it's empty. Versus doing if count equal like 0, that means it's empty. Right? Count is always in this case slower, but of course you might need it in certain cases, right? Normal things like select the fields you need, and pushing filters down to the database. I've seen a lot of some scripts that reads everything and does a loop to check for some value. You can just push that filter down to the database and save huge. That makes a huge difference, really. And just watch out for OLAP queries, like things that does a summary, unique, things like that, because attribute rules run for every feature, and if you're doing a unique on every feature, that means you're scanning the entire data set n number of times. All right, service configuration, let's talk about that a little bit. So if your rule is using another classes, like you're using feature set by name, you're reading from other class, consider publishing that target class as well. I know it's not required, especially if the rule is excluded from client evaluation. You don't really need to. I mean, even if you have one layer, you can publish that one layer, but that layer on the backend can access the entire workspace without those classes having to be published. You can do that. The problem with that is this little bit trick that you need to understand, which is the service itself does a cache of the data source it opens. So if I publish one layer, that layer at the SOC start time, we read it, definition, and we cache it in the service. And we have a cache of it. So we don't cache any other things that is not in the service unless it's required. Well, no. If it's required, we open it and we toss it because it's not in the service. There is nothing to hold on to pin the cache. Right? So just consider publishing things that are required. And we've seen some customers with this, and we noticed that there is a lot of thrashing going and opening the same class 100,000 times, and instead of just publishing that class and saving and getting a hit. Another thing is this cache that we talked about is per version, and you can actually extend it. So consider increasing it. By default, it's 5 minutes, and it's only for dedicated SOCs. Really, it makes sense, right? It's not much for shared. And if you increase it, then if I'm in a version and I make a request, then those data sources will be cached for my version. And you have, I think, up to like 50. That's the LRU size. And after 5 minutes, if this cache was not used, we toss it, right? So if you have a lot of editors making edits in their version, it's very beneficial to benefit from the same cache over and over again. So you can increase it to get better performance, but like everything in life, everything has a downside. The downside in this case, you need more memory because those SOCs will start to bloat, right? The more cache you have, the more memory you're gonna need. So it's kind of balanced. You have to kind of run through it. And the feature data set, just watch out for feature data sets. They're not really folders. I used to think them as, like 10 years ago, I used to think them as folders. And it's like, oh, let me just group everything in this feature data set. They have behaviors. If you open any class in a feature data set, by default, it means you have to open all of them. And opening is costly. By opening, I mean we read the definition of every single thing, right? So if something doesn't need to be in a feature dataset, it doesn't have to be, right? Like think of an example. You have a land-based feature dataset with 20 classes, and you have one class that reads, I don't know, counties, right? If you read the county using an attribute tool, we're gonna open the entire feature dataset, even though you didn't need it. It's just the behavior, it's just how the feature dataset's designed to be. Yeah? So it would be much more faster in that particular case to basically put that city or county in its own, at the root, for example, by itself. And it's worth considering testing this thing. Here's an example, and we're gonna hand it to Link. Here's an awesome function that takes 30 seconds to run. So what is going on here? From a first look, it looks like everything looks good. Doesn't look like a bad script or anything. But here's our things that we did. Okay? Let's go back. First, we're selecting all fields, but we're technically only reading the global ID. So if the class has like 5 fields, that's not really a big deal. That's fine. But if it has like 300 fields, you just brought all of these fields and then it's only selected one of them. The other thing is we're returning the geometry, and then we're not really using the geometry. You might say, well, I'm doing an intersect. An intersect has nothing to do with the geometry being returned. This is what do I want returned? This is what I want, the operation that I'm performing on the database. Right? So this means, as the output result, do you want the geometry or not? That's all it means. In this case, I didn't use the geometry. Yes, if I said geometry F and I did something with it, then I need the geometry. Yeah? So this should be false. This should be just global ID. And this is unnecessary, right? Because now you just did a count on all retired, well, unretired in this case, classes, right? So if you have 1 million active classes, you just counted all of them, you got 1 million, and you didn't get a 0, so you continue. This count was taken, I think, 26 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. Right? So the fix is, remove this altogether, you don't need it. Fix these, and this is enough, right? If I do an if, you just need to do a check to avoid getting a null error, because the if could be null. In this case, so you do a check and just quit. And let's get to Ling and show us an example of a slow attribute rules, and she's gonna run through the diagnostics and show us exactly where the problem is. Take it up. 5. What is going on? It's not switching.
Do you have AV tag? It's not.
All right, just take mine. Yeah, we tested before.
Yeah, we tested before, but I don't see.
That's how you test in production, by the way. Nice.
Okay, finally.
I don't know what that.
I don't know what's a flag.
Yeah, I tried to remove it.
Oh, somehow that's a small screen.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to get rid of that. Anyway, let's continue.
Anyway, there is it. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'll do a quick demo on troubleshoot attribute rule with ArcGIS Diagnostic Monitor. When editing data with attribute rule and hit slow performance, the most challenging task is identify which rule causes slowdown. We have introduced attribute rule diagnostic monitor to help monitor the behavior of attribute rules and help troubleshoot when problems occurs. Let's see how this works. I have a simple travel feature class, travel destination, with attribute rules triggered on edit. Let's do a few edits. Create new feature. Let's see its response immediately. But if I try to move, now you need to count.
Oh. So something is happening on the move.
Yeah,
not
so
necessarily-
something is happening differently. So what's going on here? Let's turn on ArcGIS Diagnostic Monitor to see what's going on behind. To enable the Diagnostic Monitor, click Ctrl, Alt, and M at the same time. In the Log tab, make sure the warning information and the debug is the log level we want to check. So now it's turned on by default. Let's do the edit again and see what's being recorded and what's the issue will be. I'll create one here and move. And now we'll check the diagnostic log. The default location of the diagnostic log will be under your user profile, ArcGIS and the diagnostics. Pro will create a unique ID for each session that enables the diagnostic monitor. Open this log. It recorded many useful information like the memory usage, database trigger. What we interest here is attribute rule. Let's find all attribute rule. For evaluate calculation rule, this is the attribute rule section that we triggered while doing the edit. Each attribute rule will have two entries in the log, the executed and the completed, or failed. So we can see here, each section, it recorded the attribute, the feature class being evaluated, the role being evaluated, and the rule name, type, etc. The most valuable information will be the evaluation time for this rule. From here, we can see it's the slow AR that takes nearly 9 seconds. This one is the first one. Sorry, I forgot this. It's the negative power. So that's
the fast.
Yeah, less than a second, very fast. It's called slow AR. And then the simple AR is also very fast, less than a second. Almost don't need to count. But if you check here, it's called slow AR on the different row, but the time is almost 8 seconds. Oh, over 8 seconds, almost 9. So this is the one that clearly causing the performance slowdown. But it's same slow AR, different behavior. The first is an insert, that we don't see any, we see the response immediately. The second is a move, and that's so slow. Now let's go back to Pro to see why we see this difference, to check the attribute rule. open the attribute rule view. You can see there are 3 attribute rules, 2 active ones. That's the slow AR and the simple AR. That's triggered when we do the edit. The slow AR is getting feature set by name, getting the travel destination feature class. And here we can see it's actually do a full scan of the feature class, of the travel destination feature class, and find each one from California and add the count. Is this correct? It is. It gives you the correct answer. But is it smart? Definitely no. Every time you're looping through the full data set, it will definitely slow down the performance. And also we check the if condition. The editor type is update, and the geometry of the feature and the original feature is different. That is how we ensure, that's how we see it only happens when you move. If you insert, the create feature is insert, so that will skip the time-consuming section. But when you do the update and also change the geometry, if you just update the attribute, you won't hit this section. I just add this so we can understand how the performance will be hit on different scenarios. So now we see this is, we also notice here, that's also against the performance tips. We retrieve every field and the geometry. But actually, we don't need this. We don't need any fields from this. So if the data set has like dozens or even hundreds of fields, this is a totally waste of bandwidth, and retrieving geometry is always expensive. So how to fix this? To fix this, I have a fast error. You can see the name. Here we just use a filter function to get the state name of California, and then get the count using the count function to get the function of the returned data set. The filter function will push the query from client side to the database side. So this way, you don't have to retrieve everything and loop one by one that's the time-consuming part. So by doing this, we can see, let's do the diagnostics and see how this will make any difference. I'll clear the previous log. Do the edit again.
I don't think you enabled it. Did you enable the rule, the fast rule?
Oh.
I don't think you.
Yes. Yeah. Let me enable the
Good
fast
catch.
rule.
I don't know if you noticed, we added the column disabled for convenience, so you can quickly disable.
Yeah, you can
and
quickly
enable.
check.
Yeah, that's something recent.
Let's do the edit again. I'll create one and do the move.
How long did that take? All right.
Besides checking from the log file directly, you can also, from the diagnostic monitor window, filter the attribute rule And you can also see the attribute rule section. Here, we can clearly see with the fast AR, now it only takes less than 3 seconds. So this is how we use attribute rule diagnostic monitor to identify performance issues from the client side. If you have ArcGIS server publish the service, you want to see the same information, you can set the ArcGIS server log level to debug, and the same information will in the server log. Yeah. Also, even though this is this diagnostic monitor give you information of you need, help you identify the performance issue, you still need to enable the rule, do the edit, trigger the rule, and check the log. Is there any easier way I can just do a quick comparison? Here's a secret. We can do using the console function. We can do through verify it run in you don't have to enable the rule, you don't have to actually do the edit. And we can get a quick value. Like if I put the time before, the timestamp before, and get a timestamp after. Can I verify and get the difference? Let's see. It doesn't seem true. Why? Because we have the condition here. We actually, in the console, we don't do any edit yet. So we remove that part. We just get the time-consuming section to run. Now let's see.
It's thinking.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, we can see the time difference, the start time, the end time, and the difference.
One more thing on the console is if you have console messages, I think started from 3.1, we started logging those console messages in the debug diagnostics. So it's very convenient. I usually recommend typing a console and then adding some sort of a keyword for you to help find those, like anything, right? Why, some sentinel value, and then you look up that value, and immediately you'll see all the console messages in your debug. That's a very nice way to immediately see, closer to debug. We still don't have full debugging, but it's very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do the console check for the first one. You see the start time and end time and difference, and that's very quickly. This is an easy way to give you the debug information of whatever you need to help you debug your rule and find the issue. So this is how we demonstrate on troubleshooting attribute rule with diagnostic monitor and the console function. Now back to Jose.
Thank you, Link. I'll have that HTML. All right. So yeah, we learned a lot in this session. There is so much information, and I'd like to open up for questions, you guys. We still have 11 minutes. We can open up for questions. If anyone have questions, go ahead.
So we have a bunch of maps that we have to take offline for offline editing.
Yeah.
So are those attribute rules coming along for the ride?
Okay.
The offline editing?
Yeah. So good question. We have offline editing. we take the data offline, do attribute rules come with the offline edit? Not yet is the answer. Right? We're working on the ability for create replica, that's the official name for it, to bring attribute rules, those that are, as we explained, allowed to execute locally, can be brought up offline in the data. We're still working on that. Yeah.
Currently, for 11.3, we will allow calculation rules in that replica.
Yeah, so any other questions? Go ahead, over there. Yeah, so if you execute the rule, if you have the rule in the geodatabase and execute it in the application, don't you execute it twice? Yes, most rules are executed twice, and most of the time it is fine because most rules are idempotent in a sense that they don't have side effects. And it is important to understand this side effect as the author of the rule and avoid things like incrementing value, like a sequence. Like if you increment, sequences won't work anywhere locally, but if you have like a logic that increments a field, that is something to watch out for. And that's why we do these sessions. If I execute the rule locally, you're gonna do an increment, then if you publish it to the server, you see another increment. So that's of course sometimes undesired. So in this particular case, you will either disable client evaluation for that particular rule, or have a certain check that, oh, this rule has already been run on the client side, skip the server side evaluation. So yeah. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Aside, you mentioned that ArcGIS Pro executes these attribute rules in the client.
Yes.
Are there other ArcGIS clients that do that as well?
Yeah, yeah. So the question was, Pro executes the clients, the rules locally, as long as they are allowed to be executed locally. Are there other clients? I'm not 100% sure, but I think the field map also, when it's connected online, it executes it locally, and then the server side also executes it. Yeah. I need to double check though, but Pro for sure, fields map, I'm 80% sure about that one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, we can end early, I think. Oh, we have one more question. Go ahead. Oh, that's a good question. So does the Pro Diagnostics log rules that are excluded from application evaluation? Well, it depends where are you in the stack, right? Pro, if it's connected to a service, and then it only downloads the rules that it allows to be executed. So those rules that are not excluded will not be downloaded to begin with, and as a result, they won't be executed locally. So they will not show up in the Pro Diagnostic, but they will definitely show up on the server side exclusion. That being said, if you are Pro connected to a file GDB directly, if you think about it, Pro as a client still downloads those rules locally, right? But then it will run the local rules, and then it will run the server, the back end rules again. So you'll see essentially twice rules. You'll see them running twice in that particular case. Go ahead.
Like that review rules could be something not just to use it as a new topic for me, but I know that there's triggers. So
Yeah.
I use them a couple of times.
Yes.
Before. I just want to know, like, do you think there's when do I decide to use triggers versus?
Okay, so the question is like attribute rules versus triggers. Triggers are convenient for certain use cases, but The problem, they are platform specific, you know? Like if I wrote a trigger on Oracle, it cannot work on SQL Server or other platforms. So that's one thing. The other thing is it's very tricky to run trigger in Esri-based classes because an insert doesn't really mean an insert sometimes, especially in like branch versioning, right? So to identify at that low level, you don't have the context of what's an update and what's an insert and what's a delete. Because, for example, in branch versioning, delete, inserts, and update are all inserts, right? So how do you tell this is a true insert versus an actual update or a delete, right? It becomes very tricky to deal with all these situations. So if you're working with the ArcGIS platform and you want a whole story, I would go with attribute rules. If you have a simple application that has nothing to do with ArcGIS, hey, I want this application, I'm always going to use Oracle or SQL Server, I would use triggers, especially if that class is a really simple class, unversioned. You know, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, attribute rules support the utility network tracing.
Will it support utility network? I'm sorry, what?
Well,
Tracing, yes. Will the attribute rule support utility network tracing? That is, we try not to, because it's not a good idea. It's just, attribute rules are supposed to run fast, and trace is not really one of the slowest things you can think of. There is so much stuff going on. So we thought about it, but in the near term, I don't think we have plans to do that. Yeah. Go ahead.
On the same topic, even if you have eventing turned on during update subnetwork,
Yeah.
is there a way to tell from context that you're running that?
Yes. So the question is, I'm running update subnetwork. For those who don't know, update subnetwork is a utility network functionality that touches every feature and updates certain field. And the question was, can I know if this is done by attribute rule, or I mean, is this update subnetwork or something, or something else, so I can skip the attribute rules essentially? Yes, because you're updating attribute rules. Because you're updating the subnetwork name, you can check the original feature, subnetwork name, and the feature. If that changed, that means there's definitely update subnetwork that did that, because it's a system field. Nobody can touch it except that, so you can quit. That being said, you're still taking the hit of evaluation in Arcade, as we talked about in the session, because there's always a cost. Once you go into the rule, you already took the hit of the Arcade engine, the evaluation, which is around 750 microseconds, 1 millisecond, right? So we're working on another feature, hopefully 3, 4, or later, which will tell you that, hey, this attribute rule, I only want to trigger it on a change of this field. Today, any update, if you have an update, any field change will trigger the rule. We're adding some more metadata in a rule that says, no, actually, only if you change this field, trigger this rule. This is going to be a very nice enhancement in the future. And that will solve the performance problem in that particular case. Any other questions? Doesn't have to be attribute rule, anything related to geodatabase branches and attribute rules. Go ahead, all the way there.
Is there any work to get Arcade into like the IDE space that we can use?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Is there any plans to bring Arcade into IDE? Yes, we're working on that. That's we're part of the separate Arcade group. We're working towards building an IDE that makes editing Arcade better. We already did for the online editor. There is a nice online editor for Arcade, but we're working to integrate it into a better IDE, like Visual Studio Code and others. Yeah. Hey, go ahead.
Simple question.
Yeah.
What can attribute rules do? Like, what are all the things that they can do?
Attribute rules it can get the current user. It can read itself. It can read other classes. It can edit other classes. It can do a lot of damage by just doing that. I can't think of anything else. But yeah, it can know whether it's in a version or default. It has the ability to read utility network associations, ability to read relationship classes, and yeah, maybe we can ask what cannot do is better. It's a better question. What can it do? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead over there.
Related to that, 2 years ago in this session, you said we're going to add the ability to look up from a service instead of just looking up within the database if we're filtering it.
Yeah.
Any progress on that?
I'm not sure if we talked about that in particular, but the question was, can we read attribute rule from a service? Maybe that was within the request. That's something attribute rule cannot do, by the way, making an HTTP call. It cannot do that today, right? We're working on a function that allows you to make an HTTP call, which will allow you to read from any service in this particular thing. There have been some progress. We're just working through the security issues of it, really. Well, we're thinking about not just introducing a function that calls any method, any URL. We're thinking about introducing some sort of a list that here's the available URLs that you can call. Here's we need to think about including a new portal item with it. So it's a lot of work. We might call it like something like service connection. So you make a connection, and that object will be used to make the request, so that it's always authenticated. It goes through the portal privileges and the whole stack. So yeah, we're still working on it. Short answer there. And we're out of time. Thank you so much, guys, for coming. Appreciate you.